The morning light crept lazily through the blinds, casting warm golden stripes across the living room floor. It should have been a peaceful scene, the kind you'd savor with a quiet cup of tea and a moment of stillness. But instead, there was tension in the air, so thick you could almost taste it. Emily stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the way she used to when she was a teenager defying me over curfew. Only this time, the defiance wasn't childish. It was sharp, deliberate, and aimed straight at me. Behind her, sprawled in the armchair like a king on his throne, sat Mark. He was cradling the coffee mug I had washed for him just an hour earlier. His legs spread wide in a show of lazy ownership. That smug smirk never left his lips, even as he pretended to glance at his phone. "Mom," Emily began, her voice stiff and rehearsed, like she had practiced this speech in the mirror. "Mark and I have been talking. And, well, he feels uncomfortable when you just sit around all day." My eyebrows rose, but I said nothing, letting her continue. "You're living here rent-free," she pressed on, glancing briefly at Mark before locking her gaze back on me. "The least you can do is help out more. Serve Mark his meals. Keep the laundry done. Clean the house properly. You know, be useful." She hesitated for half a second before delivering the final blow. "Or you can find somewhere else to live." Her words didn't just land, they pierced. My own daughter, the girl I carried for 9 long months, the girl I stayed up with through fevers and heartbreaks, was giving me an ultimatum like I was a stranger taking advantage of her hospitality. I felt the sting deep in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I studied her. She wouldn't meet my eyes for long, and why would she? She knew this wasn't her idea. This was Mark's doing. He had been planting seeds from the day I moved in 2 years ago, after my husband, Emily's father, passed away. Emily had begged me then, "Please, Mom, don't be alone. Move in with us. It'll be like old times." I had believed her. I had packed up my house, sold most of my furniture, and stepped into their home thinking I'd found a safe harbor in my grief. But over time, Mark's comments became little barbs. "Is that all you're making for dinner? You missed a spot on the floor. Shouldn't you be doing something?" And Emily, slowly but surely, began to echo him. Now here they were, no more hints, no more passive-aggressive remarks. Just a flat-out choice. Serve or leave. Mark leaned back in his chair, tilting his head like a man who just won something. He took another slow sip of coffee, eyes locked on mine, daring me to argue. But I didn't. Instead, I let a smile spread slowly across my face, the kind of smile that hides far more than it reveals. I set my teacup down gently on the table. My voice, when it came, was calm. "All right," I said. "I'll leave." Emily blinked, clearly expecting a fight. "Just like that." "Just like that," I repeated. Without another word, I walked to my room. I opened the wardrobe and pulled down the old leather suitcase my late husband had given me on our 25th anniversary. The familiar scent of worn leather hit me, and for a moment I almost faltered. But as I began folding clothes and placing them neatly inside, something shifted. I wasn't packing out of defeat. I was packing with purpose. A plan was already forming. One they wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. I left their house that same afternoon, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I refused to spend another night under a roof where my worth was measured by how quickly I could fetch coffee for a grown man. But I didn't slam doors. I didn't scream. That's not how you win a war like this. You win it with silence, with patience. I packed the rest of my belongings into the trunk of my car, glancing briefly toward the living room window where Mark stood. Arms folded, a smug grin plastered across his face. He probably thought I'd be crawling back within a week. Maybe even sooner. Emily wasn't visible. She was probably in the kitchen, pretending this wasn't happening. By sunset, I had signed the paperwork for a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy. 1 bedroom, creaky floors, the faint scent of fresh paint. But it was mine. I placed my suitcase in the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the quiet sink in. And then I opened the small, worn file folder I'd pulled from my safe deposit box before leaving Emily's. Inside were pieces of my late husband's life and mine, bank statements, property records, notes he had made in his own precise handwriting. My husband had been careful with money, quietly building a future for our family. And among the papers was something I had never shared with Emily: documentation of the trust fund he'd set up for her. The one that came with a clause. A maturity clause. She could only access it when she could prove she was financially independent, responsible, and living a life free from manipulation. My husband had written that clause specifically to protect her. At the time, I had thought it was overly cautious. Now, I understood exactly why he did it. And then there was the other account, the one tied to my name alone. 30 years of careful saving and compounding interest had turned it into a sum large enough to change a person's life, or destroy their illusions about what they deserved. I ran my fingers over the pages, thinking about Mark's expression if he ever learned the amount. I thought about Emily's face, if she realized she had already thrown away her chance to prove she was ready for her inheritance. That night, instead of lying awake and crying like Mark probably expected, I made a plan. The next morning, I started with quiet conversations. I stopped by Mrs. Patterson's house, the sweet older neighbor who always seemed to know what went on in the neighborhood. Over tea, I mentioned that I hoped Mark was still working those long hours at the casino. So much cash passing through there. Her eyes lit up. I didn't have to say more. Later, I ran into the wife of Emily's boss at the market. I casually mentioned how Mark must be exhausted from all the side business he seemed to be juggling. I didn't spell it out. People love to fill in the blanks themselves. By the end of the week, I knew whispers were making their way back to them. And then, as if on cue, an email arrived from Emily. The subject line read, "Dinner invitation." The body of the message was short. "Mark, and I would love for you to come over this Saturday night. We want to talk and clear the air." Clear the air. I almost laughed. They weren't trying to clear the air. They were trying to sniff out the money. Something had shaken their comfortable little world, and now, suddenly, I was useful again. Saturday night came wrapped in a thin veil of false warmth. The air was cool, the moon a pale sliver above the street as I parked my car in front of Emily and Mark's house. The porch light was on, casting an inviting glow over the front steps. But the welcome felt as hollow as the smile I knew Emily would be wearing. I rang the doorbell. The sound of hurried footsteps approached, and Emily opened the door, her hair pulled back neatly, her dress a little too formal for a casual family dinner. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice light but her eyes flicking nervously toward the living room. "Come in." The scent of roast chicken filled the air, but underneath it, I could smell the tension. Mark was seated at the dining table, wearing a crisp shirt, sleeves rolled up like he'd been helping prepare dinner, though I doubted he'd touched anything but a fork. "Evening," he said, leaning back in his chair with that same old smirk. "Glad you could make it." I slipped off my coat, draping it neatly over the back of my chair before sitting down. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, matching his tone. Dinner began with forced politeness. Emily asked about my new apartment, my routine. I answered simply, never giving them more than they needed. The clink of cutlery against plates was the only real conversation. It didn't take long for Mark to drop the pretense. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat, his gaze steady on me. "So about that trust fund your husband left," he said casually, though his fingers drummed lightly on the table. A tell he probably didn't know he had. Emily's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Mark," she began, but he waved her off. "We heard from someone that you've got quite a bit tucked away. And, well," he shrugged, "we think it's only fair you share it. For the house. For the family." I set my fork down slowly, resting my hands in my lap. "You want me to give it to you?" I asked, my tone as calm as still water. Mark tilted his head. "We're family. It makes sense. You don't need all that money sitting around." I studied him for a long moment, then turned my eyes to Emily. She wouldn't look at me. "Funny?" I said softly, "because just 2 weeks ago, you both made it clear my only value here was in cooking, cleaning, and running errands for you. You told me if I didn't serve Mark, I could leave. Not exactly the way you talk to someone you now expect a fortune from." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we didn't mean it like." I held up a hand. "You meant it. Every word. And now you've realized I have something you want, so you're hoping we can pretend it never happened." Mark's jaw tightened. "We're just saying it's the right thing to do." I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make him lean in too. "And I'm saying I already decided where the money's going." His brows furrowed. "And where's that?" I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face, the same one I'd worn when I packed my suitcase. "Not to you." The room went still. Mark's eyes narrowed. Emily's lips parted like she wanted to protest, but couldn't find the words. I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip and set it down again. "In fact," I said, "you might want to hear the details." Because what I was about to tell them would not only shut them down, it would change the way they looked at me forever. I clicked reply and typed a single sentence, "I'll be there," as I hit send. I could already picture the look in Mark's eyes when I told him exactly what he didn't want to hear. The silence at that dinner table was thick enough to choke on. Mark's eyes were locked on me, sharp and suspicious. Emily shifted in her seat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The roast chicken sat forgotten between us, steam curling up into the still air like the last wisps of whatever peace had been left in this house. I reached down beside my chair and pulled up a thick envelope, placing it gently on the table between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat. "This," I said, tapping it with one finger, "contains the details of exactly what I've done with my money." Mark leaned forward, his interest piqued, but I didn't open it. I wanted my words to slice deeper than any number on a bank statement could. "I've donated every cent of my personal account to a charity," I continued. "A women's shelter. One that helps women escape controlling, demeaning men who think they're entitled to respect they've never earned." Mark's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as his hand clenched on the table. Emily's head snapped toward him, her mouth opening in silent shock. "But that's not all," I said, my voice steady. "The trust fund your father left for you." "Emily, the one you didn't know about. You'll get it only if you can prove you've been living independently, free from Mark's financial and personal control, for 5 consecutive years. Until then, it remains locked." Her eyes filled instantly, a flicker of realization crossing her face. She understood exactly what that meant. Mark leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his anger with a smirk, but it was slipping. "That's ridiculous," he scoffed. "You can't just." "I can," I cut in sharply. "And I have. My lawyer has every document, every instruction. And I've left copies with people I trust. So even if something happens to me, the plan stays in place." Emily's voice cracked. "Mum, why would you do this?" I met her gaze, not unkindly, but without bending. "Because you stood there, looked me in the eye, and told me to serve your husband or leave. You let a man convince you that your own mother's worth was tied to how quickly she could bring him a plate of food. That isn't love, Emily. That's control, and I won't reward it." Mark slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "This is about revenge, isn't it?" I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt, and slipped my coat over my shoulders. "No, Mark," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is about dignity. Mine, and the one day I hope Emily will find for herself." I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. Emily called after me, her voice trembling. "Mom, wait." I stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. "When you're ready to stand on your own 2 feet, when you remember what respect looks like, I'll be here. Until then, I'm done serving people who only see me as a servant." The Mark sat rigid, his face red with fury. Emily's eyes were wet, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say more but couldn't. I stepped out into the crisp night air. The wind was cool against my face, the stars sharp and bright above. For the first time in years, I felt weightless, free not just from their house, but from their expectations, their control, their casual cruelty. As I walked to my car, I thought about how revenge doesn't always come with shouting matches or public scenes. Sometimes it's delivered in calm, measured words and ironclad paperwork. Sometimes it's not about punishing them, it's about protecting yourself. And that night, I drove away with a smile that wasn't small anymore. It was the smile of someone who had taken back her life. If you believe no one should ever have to beg for respect, subscribe. I've got more stories that prove you can stand your ground and still win.